Well, now we're going to take a look at Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato, who in turn was a student of Socrates. And you'll remember our Roman friend Cicero, with whom we opened our consideration of Plato. Well, Cicero has similarly critical things to say about Aristotle. So listen to this. Aristotle, in the third book of his philosophy, has a great many confused notions, disagreeing with the doctrines of his master Plato. At one moment, he assigns divinity exclusively to the intellect. At another, he says that the world is itself a god. Then again, he puts some other being over the world and assigns to this being the role of regulating and sustaining the world motion by means of a sort of inverse rotation. Then he says that the celestial heat is God, not realizing that the heavens are a part of that world which elsewhere he himself has entitled God. But how could the divine consciousness, which he assigns to the heavens, persist in a state of such rapid motion, where, moreover, are all the gods of accepted belief, if we count the heavens also as a god? Again, in maintaining that God is incorporeal, he robs him entirely of sensation and also of wisdom. Moreover, how is motion possible for an incorporeal being? And how, if he is always in motion, can he enjoy tranquility and bliss? Well, first of all, it's kind of hard to follow everything that Cicero is saying here, but at least you'd think that Aristotle was a confused fool, not one of the most revered minds in Western philosophy. Maybe we can understand him better by comparing Aristotle with his predecessors. First, one could say that Aristotle was a professional rather than prophetic. A key difference between Aristotle and those who went before him, namely the pre Socratics, Socrates, and Plato, was his distaste for mysticism as a means of explaining the world at large. He's not really altogether a mystic or a prophet, but more of a professional teacher. And he presents himself as altogether more systematic and critical and methodical than his predecessors. He's professorial in tone. He's kind of like me, you know what I'm talking about? Not so much prophetic. At least this was the judgment of British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, who wrote in his History of Western Philosophy: Aristotle as a philosopher is in many ways very different from all his predecessors. He's the first to write like a professor. His treatises are systematic, his discussions are divided into heads. He's a professional teacher, not an inspired prophet. His work is critical, careful, pedestrian, without any trace of Bacchic enthusiasm. The Orphic elements in Plato are watered down in Aristotle and mixed with a strong dose of common sense. Where he is Platonic, one feels that his natural temperament has been overpowered by the teaching to which he was subjected. He's not passionate or in any profound sense religious. The errors of his predecessors were the glorious errors of youth attempting the impossible. His errors are those of age, which cannot free itself from habitual prejudices. He is best in detail and in criticism. He fails in large construction for lack of fundamental clarity and titanic fire. Well, you have to appreciate Russell's writing style, don't you? By Bacchic, Russell means sensual. appealing to carnal pleasure. And he says that Aristotle has nothing of the passionate in him. And by Orphic, he means Plato leans more to the mystical, to the esoteric. Um, Russell thinks that some remaining influence of Plato remains in Aristotle, that he can't seem to free himself of it, but that he's making an effort still to impose the systematic thought of a teacher on his own philosophy, somewhat derived from the pre Socratic, somewhat derived from Plato, and yet in dialogue with them, a different philosophy. And yet, while he is less mystical than his predecessors, his metaphysics is still rooted in their thought. Underpinning Aristotle's extensive and wide ranging writings is his view of metaphysics. Later generations named his great work the Metaphysics, simply because it came after the physics, and or because it went beyond the physics or the physical. At times, Aristotle himself refers to what we might call metaphysics as theology. However, of course, this is not the theology of the modern or Christian sense. Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, was founded in a grove of Apollo Lyceus. In other words, Aristotle was a product of the pagan Hellenic world in which he lived. And we can't just simply erase that background from him. While the metaphysics is, in one sense, a departure from the mysticism found in the pre Socratic poet, prophet, thinkers who predated Plato, Aristotle's metaphysics is nonetheless defined in large part by his dialogue with these early thinkers and the concerns that informed their mystically inclined thought. Aristotle is critical of his predecessors, but he often thinks within the context and engages with the problems of their world. Maybe it's even better for us to consider Aristotle and Plato. What's essential to understand in Aristotle is that he's writing within his historical context. He writes in the world of the pre-Socratics, and he writes ideas that contradict Plato, but he also writes in the shadow of Plato as his student. He wishes to propose something different than Plato, but he can't seem to free himself entirely from the Platonic mold. So again, here's Russell. He says, on the whole, the easiest way to understand both his theory of universals and his theory of matter and form is to set forth first the common sense doctrine, which is half of his view, and then to consider the Platonic modifications to which he subjects it. Aristotle rejected Plato's doctrine of transcendental eternal forms altogether. And yet, something of Platonism still survives in Aristotle's system. It's in his belief that the reality of anything lies in a changeless, though wholly immanent and not transcendent form or essence, comprehensible and definable by reason, and that the highest realities were eternal, immaterial, changeless, self sufficient intellects, which caused the ordered movement of the universe. Now, it was the inherent desire of these intellects to give expression to their transcendent perfection, and this is what kept the heavenly spheres rotating. And the human intellect at its highest is in some way akin to these transcendent intellects. This Aristotelian doctrine of the intellect, or the nous, is related in later thought with Plato's ideas. By the term universal, Aristotle says, I mean that which is of such a nature as to be predicated of many subjects, and by individual, that which is not thus predicated. So I want you to note the empirical tendency of this statement. Aristotle isn't interested in a form that exists in some eternal realm. He says, if I look long enough at individual tables, the wooden one with four legs, the plastic one with a central pillar holding it up, the metal one that juts out of the wall at a fast food restaurant, my reflection on the empirical data might arrive at some universal quality that I call table. Aristotle wants to understand reality not so much in terms of universals or forms in which the material world participates, but in terms of universals which are like general characteristics, as distinct from substances which are specific examples. I am David. I am a specific substance. And I am a human, a universal concept. He also dislikes distinctions like the one, or I should say, he also really likes distinctions like the one and the many, the essence and the substance, the form and the matter. But mostly, Aristotle is interested in a more empirical approach to the world as it surrounds us. We'll come back in a moment and then we'll pick up on Aristotle's notions of the prime mover and deity.